This is a short briefing on the socio-economic implications of the COVID-19 health pandemic in the Philippines. And it updates our earlier briefings, which monitored the early stages of the pandemic in 2020. And this is an update prepared shortly after we experienced the 1 year anniversary of the lockdown in the Philippines, which, as you recall, was initiated in early 2020 around March, and which has now gone through a full year well into 2021. Let me begin by presenting some of the headline figures on the pandemic. As of the time of presenting this in 5 April 2021, there have been over 795,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19, with 13,425 deaths, at least according to the DOH surveillance mechanism. And as of 19 March 2021, a total of over 290,000 vaccine doses have been administered. Of course, this is quite delayed compared to some of our neighbors in ASEAN. And this is actually a small drop in the bucket compared to the total number of Filipinos that still needs to be vaccinated. By the government forecasts, it is expected that by late 2021, at least according to the government forecast, we will have acquired up to over 120 million to 130 million vaccines, enough to vaccinate up to 60 million Filipinos, if the government forecasts are to be trusted. So far, unfortunately, what we have seen are quite a bit of delays affecting the vaccine rollout protocols of government, and emerging evidence of strong vaccine hesitancy in a large proportion of the population. By some estimates, up to over 60% of the population could be displaying strong vaccine hesitancy. So these are among the challenges that the Philippines presently faces. As you can see also from the figure, there has been a recent surge in the number of cases, which actually breached the original peaks of COVID-19 cases in 2020. And so we have seen quite a number of cases exploding in March of 2021. And we have also seen quite a number of deaths in 2020. And the interesting thing about this is when the Philippine Statistics Agency released its recent estimates of the 2020 deaths in the Philippines, it suggests that 13,425 deaths is actually a dramatic underestimate of the number of deaths due to COVID-19. So in fact, according to the PSA data, if that is also closer to the truth, then the number of deaths due to COVID-19 could be closer to over twice this amount. So part of the narrative of handling the COVID-19 pandemic in the Philippines is, unfortunately, that we have earned sort of this reputation worldwide as the country with the longest lockdown. And the lockdown, of course, in the international practice of containing COVID-19, lockdowns and mobility restrictions are important means for policymakers to control the spread of the disease. But the main objective of the lockdown is not to be imposed for a protracted period of time. The main objective is to actually strengthen the healthcare system and the test, trace, and treat system of the country while a lockdown is in place, so that when this is already in shape, you will be able to lift the lockdown and open the economy up again. So many countries that have actually managed to control COVID-19, while at the same time minimizing its socio-economic negative implications on the country, those successful countries are the ones with the short lockdown periods and the fast catch up of their test, trace, treat systems and stronger healthcare systems. This is unfortunately not the case for the Philippines, and according to the at least one estimate, every day of lockdown costs the Philippines up to 18 billion pesos. And suffice to say that lockdown is a very, very costly means to control the pandemic, and it is certainly not meant to be implemented for protracted periods of time. So when the lockdown was initiated in 2020, by the middle of the year, the government estimated that up to 26% of businesses closed operations already, meaning that many Filipinos lost their jobs due to these business closures. And Dole estimates that up to 10 million workers, even in that first period of lockdown, already lost their jobs due to COVID-19 pandemic. And this was in the middle, around the middle of 2020. And since the lockdown has been quite protracted and has been continued in an on again, off again manner since the middle of 2020, we can expect that even more workers may have lost their jobs in that period following this. And finally, there are also estimates released by Social Weather Station that up to 5.2 million families went hungry. And this is a large number of families being plunged back into poverty, into hunger, essentially because of the severity of the lockdown and the protracted nature, the long lockdown feature, which kept many, many families away from having the chance to earn incomes and the chance to actually recover. So unsurprisingly, some early estimates by the Philippine Institute of Development Studies suggest that up to 1.5 million Filipinos are seen to be sliding back into poverty due to COVID-19. And in fact, this was released around the third quarter of 2020. And since the lockdown has been protracted and has been applied in an on again, off again manner since then, we can probably expect that more Filipinos may have fallen into poverty in the period following this initial estimate. When people lose their jobs, people lose access to their income streams, they start to deplete their savings. They start to deplete the wealth that they have been able to somehow accumulate over time. And due to the protracted nature of this pandemic and the lockdowns that we have been relying on to control it, it is expected that many Filipinos' buffers at the household level are likely to have been eroded and are probably at this point very, very thin. This requires, therefore, a consideration of state support and strong social protection support, ayuda, so as to supplement the means of Filipino families to buffer the impact and implications of the pandemic and the lockdown itself. And we have seen many instances of families drawing down on their savings, having to rely on pawn shops, for instance, to generate additional resources in order to survive. And now that we have been experiencing the pandemic for well over a year now, we can expect that the assets, the buffers of many Filipinos are actually, particularly low-income Filipinos and poor Filipinos, are probably very, very thin at this point. Now, in terms of the larger economic actors, such as the conglomerates and the bigger businesses in the Philippines, they have also been severely impacted by the crisis. These are some of the performance indicators for some of the larger corporations and conglomerates in the country prior to the crisis. And I will show you here that um, the initial estimates of the impact of the crisis are by registered around the middle to the third quarter of 2020 suggest that many of these large firms have been severely negatively impacted by the lockdown and the pandemic. And the reason for this appears to be that uh, one, many of our economic actors, the larger ones, are very, very sensitive to policy tools such as mobility restrictions and lockdowns. So this exposes a structural weakness in the Philippine economy because of our large retail sector and our large services sector, our large tourism sector, which are actually underpinned by high mobility and thrive in high mobility because that's what you need in order to increase tourism, to increase retail sales, and for these services to thrive. These are very, very vulnerable to pandemics and the necessary lockdowns that controlling these pandemics somehow imply, right? So this is food for thought in terms of thinking of a post-pandemic new normal aspiration for the country, that our very own structure in the economy makes it a little more vulnerable to the type of shock that has just affected the Philippines in 2020, COVID-19. This is another example of one of our bigger firms, Jollibee, that actually invested abroad. And because abroad, they have also been affected by the pandemic, and they have this investment is in terms of services investments abroad. They have also been severely affected by the crisis, and we can expect that maybe in the corporate sector there is now ongoing thinking as far as creating some diversity in investments and possible creation of portfolios that are slightly more resilient because they are slightly more diversified to the kind of shock that we have experienced in 2020 and going into 2021. So again, food for thought in terms of domestic investments and foreign investments that may be highly sensitive to aggregate shocks like pandemics, and with the expectation that there could be more uh, risks of pandemics in the future, so that future strains of the coronavirus and other viruses may affect the world again, and again plunge the world into future pandemics, then it further fuels this expectation that there could be some recalibration in economic strategy and business strategy in terms of making economies and businesses slightly more resilient to this kind of shock. Now, I'm just going to show you that in our neighborhood in ASEAN, in fact, many of the countries have had a very, very difficult year in 2020, but the degree of contraction in terms of gross domestic product across these countries varies, with the Philippines actually posting one of the worst economic performances in the region, largely because of the protracted nature of our lockdown and the inability to demonstrate that our test, trace, and treat system and our healthcare system can actually handle any potential resurgence of the coronavirus when we started to lift the mobility restrictions. In fact, when we started to lift the mobility restrictions, COVID-19 in the Philippines started to surge again. And so if businesses and economic stakeholders see this, they actually see that the healthcare systems and the test, trace, treat systems are not able to contain the virus, then understandably there is a weakening of consumer confidence as consumers and investors see that it is not safe to actually open up the economy. So one thought that I would share with you today is that there is no real dichotomy between health and the economy. You need both in order for us to um, demonstrate some degree of resilience from the COVID-19 pandemic. We need to strengthen our healthcare system so that we can demonstrate that we are beating the coronavirus and containing its spread. And we need to have a strong mass vaccination program that counteracts any challenges such as vaccine hesitancy. And then that will feed into the confidence to open up the economy again and our overall effort to resuscitate consumer and investor confidence in the Philippine economy. So that's really the sort of the holistic view of what we're after. Nevertheless, where are we now in early 2021? This is I'm making this presentation around the first quarter of 2021. We have actually experienced a very dramatic negative implication on the Philippine economy and in some aspects of poverty and society. We have had the biggest GDP contraction on a quarterly basis since 1947. We have had high inflation, unfortunately, the highest, I believe this is a quarterly inflation indicator. And this is quite disturbing because the pandemic and the lockdowns may have actually disrupted uh, supply chains for various products which have then contributed to potential inflation concerns in the Philippines. So this is something that we need to monitor. As I mentioned earlier, the confidence index, the consumer confidence index, is actually quite weak in the country because it's so evident that policymakers and the government, uh, they are unable to mobilize and lead the country in ways that will contain the spread of the virus and um, restore confidence in opening up the economy again. So consumer confidence is actually at an all-time low as far as that indicator is concerned. Um, there is a very high self-rated hunger recorded. It's actually the highest since 2012. And self-rated poverty has also jumped up. It's the highest since 2014. And the unemployment has actually increased dramatically as well, and it's the highest since 1995. So part of the challenge in order to mount some kind of counter-cyclical response, some kind of investment into the healthcare system, into things like PPEs and the means by which we will combat the spread of coronavirus. Uh, as your economy is contracting, your uh, public revenues are actually contracting as well. Your tax revenues are contracting. And so the pressure on public spending is downward. So in the Philippines, we have had to rely on public debt, external borrowing to some extent, in order to finance some of our counter-cyclical and crisis responses. Because the GDP is contracting, and the borrowing has actually been increasing as a response to the virus, to the coronavirus and the pandemic. The debt to GDP ratio in the Philippines has actually increased by at least 12 percentage points. And so we have been monitoring this. And the numerator and the denominator are essentially conspiring to jack up the debt to GDP ratio. So it's very critical that the way that we respond, where we actually spend those resources, will be very efficiently and effectively deployed so that we can come back and bring back some degree of resilience in the Philippine economy. Unfortunately, the record for the past year or so has not been so sanguine. And so analysts, including international analysts, have been predicting, and this is one of the predictions since around July of 2020, that the Philippines will likely not manage a V-shaped recovery. In fact, some are expecting a U-shaped or an L-shaped recovery, essentially a protracted downward trend. The credit rating agencies have also signaled that the new lockdowns and the protracted lockdown, on again, off again lockdown status of the Philippines may further erode the Philippines ratings buffers, and this is bad news because it may actually lead to a further deterioration in our macroeconomic fundamentals, and also a further tightening in our access to both domestic and external resources. And A large part of the analysis in terms of what is keeping us back is the governance of the crisis response, and so there are many analysts at this point pointing to the leadership vacuum, the weak leadership that seems to have been demonstrated during this period of pandemic, and something which does not essentially strengthen investor and consumer confidence when you have this kind of a situation in terms of the leadership in crisis response. Now, it's very, very important to emphasize the role of individual citizens, of families, as the front lines of combating the coronavirus. So we must all, as citizens, do our part in order to help stop the spread of this particular disease. Uh, However, uh, leadership also is very, very critically important because it is the collective action of the different stakeholders, citizens, families, communities, different agencies, government agencies, the private sector, civil society. It is this whole of nation uh, approach and response that is critical to controlling the spread of the coronavirus, and basically um, strengthening our institutions, our health system, and our test, trace, and treat system, so that we are able to demonstrate resilience against the coronavirus. And that's, it seems, is where many analysts point to the weakness in this leadership and in this public sector response. So a growing number of analysts are now pointing to a potentially prolonged delay in the recovery of the Philippines, which is obviously not very good. And There is now growing concern that even government forecasts are too rosy and may not necessarily be accomplished based on the failures to hit government targets and government timelines that have been set forth already in the past year. What does this do? Well, what it does in terms of the psychology of recovery, the confidence that you have that we will be able to recover, is that it's not very, very conducive. It's not very, very positive. So the statistics coming out of SWS from their survey in the middle of 2020 is that a record 43% of Filipinos see life worsening in the next 12 months. And I think follow-up surveys, including by other outfits, tend to contribute to this general negative uh, perspective of the recovery prospects for the Philippines. And certainly the consumer confidence survey of the central bank, which we have been also monitoring, tends to support this general view that it's a very, very negative outlook on the Philippines right now. Part of that negative outlook may have to do with the messaging coming from the top leadership of the country itself, including some of the key managers of the pandemic, as well as the head of state itself. And I won't belabor the point. We have been getting mixed signals from the leadership as far as the nation's capability, resources, and general confidence in its ability to control the coronavirus and mount a resilient bounce back for the Philippine economy. So certainly, if you have mixed messages there, that is not going to be helpful and may even be quite detrimental as far as restoring the confidence necessary to bounce back from this crisis. So unsurprisingly, when the public sector says that, well, let me first point out that as I am presenting this, making this presentation, the Philippines again went into a tighter lockdown, back to ECQ, in early April of 2021. And the government has actually seen fit to extend the lockdown further, but has also signaled that it is unlikely to lengthen that extension uh, because of presumably the argument that the Philippine economy cannot take much more lockdown any further. And we do need to now consider ways to smartly open up the economy, because essentially the lockdown itself is also imposing a very, very high economic and human development cost on the Philippine economy and society. Unfortunately, when the Philippine government signals that it's unlikely to extend strict lockdown again, this already generates some second guessing and some responses whereby people expect, or some economic stakeholders expect, that it may not be able to keep to this promise, given that during the lockdown, it was not clear to what extent the healthcare system and the test, trace, and treat system was actually being dramatically upgraded and dramatically strengthened. And this, I think, goes to the crux of the problem right now, that the lockdown is the blunt instrument that the Philippines has had to rely on in order to contain the spread of coronavirus. But while the Philippines has been in lockdown, it does not appear to have strengthened the key systems so that it can lift the lockdown with some confidence and begin to operate the economy again. So, in the words of an analyst from the World Bank, it appears that the Philippines has been among the least successful in the region in transitioning away from shutdowns to a more efficient containment strategy. So it goes back to the blunt instrument of lockdown, repeatedly. And the tough response has imposed a big cost on the economy without delivering a commensurate benefit in terms of containment of the disease. So this is already coming out of a report from the World Bank. It's actually a report on the Asian region as it tries to bounce back from the pandemic. And unfortunately, we stand out in the region as one of the countries with the weakest responses to the pandemic and the weakest crisis management, as far as the pandemic is concerned. Now, let me begin to end with some thoughts on the long-term implications, socioeconomic implications of a poor handling of the coronavirus pandemic. And here I'm just going to show you an illustration of the education system and how there have been unequal capabilities to thrive under the lockdown conditions and under the pandemic. Now, it's very clear that the richer children, the children from the more well-off families, are able to somehow continue their education, continue their human capital build up, while those children from poor and low-income households, particularly those households where the main breadwinners have lost their jobs or been dislocated, um, this will actually impose on those children even more burden during the pandemic. And so they are unlikely to mount a resilient response to the pandemic challenges. So I find it useful to turn to this quote by Damien Barr, who has described it very, very amply, I think. We are not all in the same boat, referring to the pandemic. We are all in the same storm. Some are in super yachts, some are in bigger boats, and some have just the one oar. So some are in really, really poor situations and are actually trying their best to just keep afloat. So I think one of the main concerns going forward into the rest of 2021 and perhaps 2022 and beyond is the unequalizing impact of the coronavirus pandemic, the differences between those who can thrive from a work from home situation and those who are daily wage earners who are immediately impacted by job losses and business closures, and those who need to take risks every day in order to keep on earning, and those who are immediately impacted by lockdown, because lockdown, of course, does not severely impact those who can still work from home, but definitely severely impacts those who need to travel to factories, who need to travel to their places of work in order to continue to earn and in order to continue to produce value for the economy. So let me end here, and I thank you again for the chance to share some of these initial evidence, indicators, and analyses on how the Philippines is faring on its effort to combat the coronavirus and bounce back from this pandemic situation.